Jam. Entertainment.
You got to go back at least 60,000 years. 60,000 years when Africans first migrated out of Africa. You got to understand is that the big misconception is that when Africans first migrated out of Africa, it was like three different races that sprout out when we were all one African race, one dark seed. But when they sprouted out and migrated into Europe, there was already Eurasians that already occupied the northern tip of Europe, and they would be the Neanderthal group of actual Neanderthals, or what people will call today genus Homo. You follow what I'm saying? And the problem is that what people are doing is they're trying to mesh both together, or just make it into a climatology thing in the variance of the epidermis of the skin and what makes the different human beings. But in reality, that's not the case, because if that was the case, the actual Africans that went into Europe, they wouldn't have encountered anybody else. They would have been the first people that were there, and that wasn't the case. The thing is that when you go back, let's say 100,000 years into the Khoisan group, and this is documented by several anthropologists and archaeologists, they say that they came out of South Africa and migrated into Europe and occupied at least 70% of Europe. And you know that from the cave art, the Chateau cave art that you see in parts of France and in parts of Paris. And they encountered what people will call today the Neanderthals, but they would be part of what you would call, again, the genus Homo group. And they inhabited the area that the Neanderthals were already in, because the first and the biggest misconception is that people think that the European is indigenous to Europe, or the Neanderthal, which people call today white people, is indigenous to Europe. In reality, they're not. They just end up migrating into that area after being in a state of what's called genus Homo. But they were just a group of what people call genus Homo at that time period. So what happened was they ended up inhabiting the same area as the Khoisan, or what people will call today the Bushmen or the Grimaldi group. And so because of being in the same area, they ended up basically cohabiting, and that sped up that group of Neanderthals from being what they were 60,000 years ago as just pure Neanderthal to what they ended up becoming, which was modern white man or Neanderthal 6,000 years ago. Because there's a difference between what the Neanderthal was 60,000 years ago and what they became 6,000 years ago, what people would call the modern white man. And what they did, and this is in a case study that went on in May of 2011, you had what's called the Neanderthal Genome Project. The Neanderthal Genome Project took every different group, what people will call races today, and they did a blood test going from the African to the Asian to what people call Latina to the European, was really the Neanderthal. And they found out that every other racial group on the planet has Neanderthal DNA in them except for the African. You follow what I'm saying? And they made the confession. In reality is that you have the whites who are Neanderthal, but they are actually only 96% human being. And this goes back to the Neanderthal Genome Project. And see, the problem is they also did tests on the Asian. Then you find out that the Asian is only 98% human being, and they're 2% Neanderthal. And the rest of the human beings on the planet, which is really variants of Africans based on mixture, are really the only 100% human beings. Because you have the Latinos, but they will be a mixture of many different races. So they would have the Neanderthal blood, whereas also what a lot of us Black Americans, we are a mixture of them, admixtures, because of slavery and parts of Kemet and different parts of time. But in reality, the only pure human on the planet is the African. And so when you go further into making compare and contrast with different stories of how whites came into existence, such as the Ice Age and the lack of vitamin D and getting caught 10,000 years ago, is what a lot of people call the Wormian Ice Age. The first person to come into this information, really the first one to bring it, that was of African descent, was a man named Sheikh Anta Diop in 1975. And that was his hypothesis in terms of climatology and what makes the different variant groups on the planet. But the reality is that if you were comparing it to, let's say, an albino, an African albino just lacks skin melanin in the melanocytes, but his genetic is still the same. His or her genetics is still the same. Whereas what that will be called is what's called the OCA-2 gene. The OCA-2 gene is common in the African. That's what separates the Neanderthal from the DNA of the African. Whereas when they did the test on the Neanderthal, they had what's called the OCA-1 gene. And the OCA-1 gene is totally different. That's the first stage of being born without melanin, not losing it in an ice age, but being born melanin recessive. And it also not only affected the skin melanin, but affected their genetics as well as their organs. And so, whereas with the African albino, it just dealt with the melanocytes of the epidermis of the skin and dealing with the hair color as well, because then they would lose the dark brownish hair pigment and it would end up becoming what people call blondish hair. And so that's the difference, because you have to go back again, what creates, because you got to realize Sheikh Anta Diop's thesis, because we use Diop because he was a great scholar, but Diop's thesis lacks the genetic connection. See, once you put DNA into it, then that ends the speculation and just a story, because there is no proof of a Wormian Ice Age. But you can go back to May of 2011 and you can find the Neanderthal Genome Project. Neanderthal Genome Project gives you the actual genetic proof of a testing to show that the Neanderthal or white race or Asian race, both of them are not even pure human. And so that's the problem, is that we're not using DNA as much. We're just using great scholars' hypothesis as opposed to using what genetic testing does, which gives us the facts that we need to show who's really human and who's not on the planet. So that's the thing when you're dealing with Neanderthals. And also want to add as well is that when you're dealing with the Neanderthal race, because the question is, where does melanin start in the body? And it starts in the pineal gland, and that's what secretes the melanin that's needed in all parts of the body. When you're dealing with, let's say, again, the organs, which is, from the brain first, which is neuromelanin, going all the way down from that into organ melanin, and then you have what's called sperm melanin. Sperm melanin is the same thing with a man and a woman. When they come together, sperm hits ovum, and that's what gives the potency to the human being. Whereas when you're dealing with Neanderthals or the white race, because they lack melanin in all forms of their body, that's why they end up becoming very sterile. And also when they did the testings of the Neanderthals, they found out that Neanderthals were very sterile people. Because if you do your research, people realize is that they always ask the question, how were they able to reproduce? And they were able to reproduce a lot better because they began to mix with the Khoisan of 30 to 60,000 years ago, those who inhabited Europe first. And so when you're dealing with, and that's why if you look into most whites or Neanderthals, they lack a certain amount of children. That's why if you look, a lot of their offspring comes out with diseases and things like that, because they themselves lack a certain amount of genetic makeup that makes them a potent human being, because they are nothing but, in reality, mutants, or really half animal or mostly animal. But whereas now, because of the genetic connection now, or the mixing, they become a little more human, but in reality they're not even pure. Again, they're not all the way pure human.